The fifth covenant we will go over is the Davidic Covenant. This covenant reveals God's authority in his kingdom. Namely, this covenant is going to reveal who the king will be who will reign in God's kingdom forever. Let me paint a picture of the historical context for this covenant. The Davidic covenant first appears in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The context of this passage is that King David is at his palace during a time of peace. Next to his palace was the tabernacle. If you remember, the tabernacle was the tent that Israel used to worship God during their time in the wilderness. Well, even after they settled into their promised land, Israel still worshiped God in this tent. And so when David looks at this tent and he compares it to his palace, he notices that something is off. Now, when the king lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." So David recognizes that it is not right that he lives in a better house than God, that he lives in a luxurious house of cedar while God's presence is housed in a tent. And so here David decides he wants to build a temple for God, a house worthy of God's glory. When David tells the prophet Nathan about his desire, Nathan gives David permission to build this temple. However, that night, God came to Nathan to relay a message to David and to stop him. Why? Because David disqualified himself from building God's house since he was a man of war and violence and he killed a lot of people. However, God did recognize David's intention and motive, so he wants to honor that with a promise or a covenant. Now, this covenant God makes with David is also an unconditional covenant like every other covenant besides the Mosaic covenant, because God does not place any conditions of obedience to it like he does with the Mosaic covenant. So what is in this covenant? First, God promises to make David's name great. "And I have been with you wherever you went and have cut off your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth." The fact that David is considered the greatest king in Israel's history shows us that God did fulfill this part of the promise, because thousands of years later, we are still talking about King David. But then we see that God promises another thing in this covenant. Second, God reaffirms the promise of the land that he first made with Abraham. "And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more." This promise of land is important in defining Israel as a nation. As I mentioned before, the difference between a people group and a nation is the possession of a homeland. That's why when Israel was even in exile in another place, they always wanted to come back to their homeland because they understood that without possessing their homeland, they were not really a nation. And so by repeating this promise of land, God is reassuring David that Israel will continue to be a nation in the future, just as he first promised to Abraham. The third thing that God promises to David is that David's son will succeed him as king of Israel, and that his son, namely Solomon, will be the one who ends up building his temple. "I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name." Later we see that this promise begins to unfold when Solomon ends up building the temple by bringing the best materials from around the world, including the cedars of Lebanon, pure gold, and all types of precious stones. In fact, to show you the massive scale of the temple, the building project requires 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters, and 3,300 foremen to supervise this project. And so Solomon ended up building the greatest temple in Israel's history, just as he promised David. The fourth thing that God promises in this covenant is that a future descendant of David, a physical descendant, will eventually have an everlasting kingdom on earth. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." This promise is a reference to the future Messiah, or the future Christ, referring to the anointed one, who will have a kingdom on earth that will last forever. In fact, we see that God says that this Messiah will physically come from David. And the word house in this context refers to the idea of a dynasty, which means that God is promising that David's lineage will become a future dynasty, and that this future king, or the Messiah, will also be viewed by God as his own son. And so how does this covenant become fulfilled? Because if you keep reading, you see in Israel's history that David's line doesn't become a dynasty. In fact, all of his descendants for the most part were corrupt, and only one of them survived by the time you get to the Babylonian exile. Well, we see that several prophecies later on, especially in the book of Isaiah, points to this promised descendant of David called the son of David from the Davidic Covenant. And when you look at all these different prophecies together, you start to see how this covenant gets fulfilled, even though in Israel's history, you don't see a good king come out of David's line. Let's look at the first prophecy. As for me, I have set my king on Zion. By the way, Zion is another name for Jerusalem, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And so in this first prophecy, we see that this future king is spoken of as the Son of God. Notice that God says that this future king will be set on Zion, which is Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem, this king will have the nations as his heritage, meaning that he will have authority over every nation in the world. In fact, God adds that his authority will cover the ends of the earth. By the way, this correlates with what Jesus is going to say later to his disciples when he gave the Great Commission. Remember how he started it? He said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And then he tells his disciples to take this authority and make disciples where? Of all nations of the world to the ends of the earth. And so we see in the first prophecy, the scope of the authority of this future son of David. He won't just have a kingdom in Israel. He won't just be a king who rules from Jerusalem, but this kingdom will cover the entire world. Again, when you look at Israel's history, you don't see this happening. Israel never became this empire, and David's physical lineage never turned into a dynasty. Instead, they were slave nations to Assyria, to Babylon, to Persia, and later to the Romans. And so is God's promise given to David still going to happen? Well, let's look at the second prophecy regarding the son of David. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now we start to get a clearer picture of the son of David. He is described with divine attributes that were only reserved for God himself. First, he's called Wonderful Counselor. This doesn't mean that he's a nice therapist. The word wonderful is the idea where we get miracles or signs and wonders. And so this king has miraculous power, and he is known as a counselor. And here a counselor is not referring to a therapist, but is referring to an advocate like a lawyer. So this future king will perform miracles and advocate for his people. Now he is called Mighty God and Everlasting Father, which were terms only used for Yahweh throughout the Old Testament. And then we see that he is called the Prince of Peace, meaning that under his reign, there will be world peace. Now, we later know that this prophecy points to Jesus when the angel Gabriel references this prophecy when telling Mary about Jesus. However, if you look at the world today, is the world living in peace? Is the government on Jesus' shoulders, meaning that all nations bow down to him? Is Israel restored as a nation and as the center of Jesus' kingdom? No. And so what we see is that even though Jesus came thousands of years ago, and even though his first coming may have started the fulfillment of this prophecy, we see that this prophecy is still not fulfilled. In other words, the Davidic Covenant is still in play until Jesus returns again, and all of these conditions that are promised will finally happen. Let's look at a final prophecy about Jesus that will hopefully bring all of this together. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Now a shoot is something that comes out of a stump to signify that there's still life in that tree even though it looks dead. And this prophecy now is going to bring all of this together. By the time you get to the New Testament, you see that Israel has been judged and their kingdom has been destroyed, and we don't see any descendant of David reigning at that time. And so everybody would have assumed that this promise that God gave to David hasn't happened and will never happen. However, this prophecy says that a shoot will come out from the stump of Jesse, and Jesse, by the way, is David's father, who will come forth to restore Israel as a nation and end up ruling over the kingdom that was promised back to David. And we know who this shoot ultimately points to. It points to Jesus when he identifies himself this way at the very end of the book of Revelation. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. Notice the phrase root and the descendant of David. Jesus is the only one who has physically come from David, meaning that he's the shoot that comes out of the stump of Jesse, but he is also the root of David, meaning that he is the Lord of David and even the creator of David. So how is Jesus both the root and the shoot of David? Because he is the promised son of David from the Davidic Covenant, who physically comes from David, but is ultimately the one who will rule over David and the nations of the world. And so what we see in this covenant is that the sign of this covenant is the throne of David. And although in history we don't see any king from the New Testament forward reign on that throne, we know from the Apostle Paul that after Jesus died and resurrected, he ascended into heaven to sit on this throne at the right hand of the Father. And we also know that many of the prophecies and the conditions have not been fulfilled. We don't see world peace. We don't see nations bowing down to King Jesus. We don't see every world leader submitting to him. But in the final kingdom, when Jesus returns and establishes his presence on earth forever, we see that all the nations of the world will bow down to King Jesus. Every king will come pay homage to him in Jerusalem. And so in Jesus' first coming, we see part of the fulfillment of the Davidic Covenant in that Jesus is revealed as the son of David, who was anointed with the Holy Spirit, empowered to bring miracles and signs and wonders, given wisdom to help the poor and to bring justice. But the final fulfillment of this covenant will not be seen until Jesus returns again and rule as king forever.